Welcome to Crunching Tackles, where we break down the hardest hitting social issues in sports. On today's show, we discuss some various headlines surrounding transgender issues in sports, both in the WNBA and at the Supreme Court. My name is Chad Wiley, and with me, as always, is John Nekrasov. And John, I just want to go ahead and dive right in. This is our big topic for this podcast. If you want to hear some of our thoughts about the Premier League or even a little bit of Spider-Man thoughts, that was in our previous episode, the last one before this that you can go listen to. But this is our big story for now. This is in many ways the biggest thing that we missed during the World Cup was the landmark decision by the Supreme Court ruling in a case called West Virginia versus B.P.J. And we're also going to talk about the WNBA, the controversy surrounding Sophie Cunningham, the discussions by the WNBA leadership around eligibility, and some particularly trollish behavior by two former NBA players. John, do you want to start with like the serious academic rigor, or should we start with the trollish culture war issues that are sweeping up Twitter?
Well, I think we have to start with the academic stuff because I think the WNBA drama in all forms doesn't fully stem from the Supreme Court ruling, but I do think it is informed by the Supreme Court ruling that came this summer. And I think it's good to say as we start this conversation, we've discussed the issue of transgender women in women's sports specifically multiple times on this show over the last, 6 or so years that we've done this show. We talked about it in part in relation to the Paris Olympics. I guess it was 2 years ago now. That's weird. Time has flown.
That's crazy.
I just my mind literally got.
Remember we were talking about how dirty the water was in Paris? Like that was the biggest
feels
thing.
What? That feels like it was last year.
Yeah.
Anyway, be that as it may, the boxing issue that came up during the Olympics, which was a separate issue, but was related and brought up a lot of sports related debates. Obviously, transgender participation in women's sports was a huge issue in the 2024 election as well. It has been an issue for years before that, and we've discussed it through different lenses at various times. We are now at a point where these cases, where legislation has been passed, I believe in 27 states, limiting the participation of transgender women on women's sports teams. And we have now reached the point where, litigation regarding those state legislation has reached the Supreme Court, I believe on multiple occasions. I don't think this is the first time. And so we've talked about it in different lenses, but I just want to set the stage and just say, we take this issue very seriously. We don't, on this show, we try as much as possible to not take this as a culture war topic, but as something to think through with empathy and also the seriousness that it deserves from every angle. And so if you are arriving to this show from social media clips of various kinds, I hope that you take the show as seriously as we do, because we really do, regardless of your political perspective. We think that, at least I think that this is a topic that, though it touches politics, is a human problem and impacts people in different ways and needs to be dealt with accordingly. So,
yeah, I would just add that the empathy that we endeavor to show to all people stems from the fact that we reckon this podcast is part of the sporting community, and we love sports, and we want sports to be an inclusive and accessible thing for as many people as possible, while also, in a way that is safe and fair. And I kind of view it like we have to steward this thing that we love, which is sports. And we have to steward it well, because there's a reason why we care about it. And
right.
So because of that, issues like this are very important and are very complicated and require just, like you said, a level of nuance and holding things in tension that we never see on social media, but that hopefully here on a longer form podcast, we can do that well. So I think that was an important preamble to start with.
Yeah, very well put.
It's very interesting, John. I think it might have been I think it's a really an underreported story in the last 2 years, and it's mentioned many times in the ruling of this Supreme Court decision, which is the fact that both the International Olympic Committee and the NCAA, and like you mentioned, 27 states in the United States have determined that eligibility for sports in youth sports, in collegiate sports, and in the international Olympic sports are determined exclusively based on biological sex. That obviously was not the case in the NCAA when Leah Thomas was swimming. That was not even the case several years ago in the Olympics. This is a new thing that's happened in the last year or two, and it's with that lens that a transgender girl who is initialed B.P.J. in this case um, brings a petition to the Supreme Court seeking eligibility to compete in high school track and field in West Virginia. And in a 6-3 decision, that split loosely along ideological lines or mostly on ideological lines, the court ruled that neither Title IX nor what's the clause? The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment can require states to allow transgender athletes to participate in youth sports. That it is within the ability of the state governments legally to limit participation in sports to sex assigned at birth. That's kind of the fundamental basis of the case. The three liberal justices, Sotomayor, Barrett, and Kagan, dissented. And we're going to, of course, break it all down. Where would you kind of like to start? We both spent a lot of time reading dense but interesting legal documentation over the last couple of days.
Yeah, I would say that legal corner of Crunching Tackles is, this is a serious topic again, but it is one of our favorite corners. It's not often that we get to sit down and read Supreme Court briefings for this show, and when we do, it's a dense time and an interesting time. I think maybe we can talk about, just to start, let's talk through what the implications of this case actually are, because I think when you just like go down and read blog posts reporting on SCOTUS, you can read it and be like, okay, that seems like a big deal, but like, why is it a big deal? What is the point of what they were arguing for? And maybe we can take a step back and just talk about Title IX to start. So Title IX was created essentially as a way to stop discrimination against women in the educational system, specifically by institutions that receive federal funding. It was not, as Justice Kavanaugh outlined in his majority opinion, it was not something that had anything to do with sports initially. But over time, sports programs through educational programs do receive federal funding. And so its scope kind of expanded to include sports. Title IX is what informs colleges having to give the same amount of scholarships to women as they do to men in collegiate sports, which causes, the classic situation where you may have tons of men's football scholarships, and then you have men's basketball scholarships, and then, you may have women's basketball scholarships, and then a ton of Olympic sports that have female scholarships that don't have the same equivalent on the men's side. And the reason for that is that there does have to be a 1-to-1 ratio between them. That's just one of the kind of classic effects that in your normal life you would see within a collegiate athletics program due to Title IX. So this is important. I don't know if you have any other kind of thoughts on the framework of Title IX before we move on into what this has to say about Title IX particularly.
Well, if you're our age, you think you've always viewed at least youth and collegiate sports as equal. So one
Right.
thing that I was surprised by that Kavanaugh's opinion opened with is just showing the need for something like Title IX at the time it was created. What he said is that in 1972, the year before Title IX was created, only 300,000 high school girls played sports compared to 3.6 million high school boys. So literally less than 10% of the amount of high school girls played sports as high school boys. In 1972, at the college level, women's sports accounted for only 2% of college athletic spending. 98% went to men. That's the frame, that's the circumstances under which Title IX was created. It was created to solve a real problem, and it has. Youth sports participation at the high school level is basically equal now. And as you mentioned, there are rules requiring that collegiate investment is also equal or comparable in certain ways. Um, at the core of this discussion, and both sides, I don't know if everyone in culture agrees with this, but both sides of this legal issue affirmed the fact that the existence of women's sports is because of the physical distinctions between men and women. And Title IX was created with the understanding that if all sports were co-ed, women would not have an equal opportunity to compete because men would dominate co-ed sports in terms of not only success but participation based on physical characteristics that make boys more athletic. Kavanaugh goes into some detail. He cites the IOC study that they used that actually looked at different acts of athleticism and actually compared the percentage increase that the average male athlete would have over the average female athlete. And all that's true. Like even the existence of the WNBA, for example, is premised on the fact that there needs to be a WNBA because a WNBA player would not obtain a roster spot in the NBA to the extent that the NBA could ever be a co-ed league. It functionally would not be because WNBA players would not meet the criteria physically, athletically to play with NBA players. And I think that's just like sometimes that gets lost in like the culture of like defining what is a woman and things like that. And to the extent that some of that is interesting or trollish, we can talk about that later. But the existence of Title IX and the existence of women's sports is premised on just that basic truth.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think when we drill into the nuances of this case, as I understand them at least, and feel free to jump in as you chatted a little bit more Supreme Court reading than I did, so I feel well prepared, but maybe
This is my hobby.
not as much of a legal expert as Chad is. So I think what I would say is that, as I understand this case, B.P.J. is arguing that essentially her not being allowed to compete on this women's team violates the clauses of Title IX that mean that she can't be discriminated against on the basis of her sex. And she is claiming that as a transgender woman, that means that if she is not allowed to compete on the team, she is being essentially discriminated against on the basis of her gender. And that is basically the crux of the argument that the majority and the minority on the Supreme Court split over. And there's a lot of nuances to that, which we can get to. But the question that we end up having to ask is, does Title IX require that anyone who identifies as a woman, not biologically, but, does Title IX include sum total transgender women, not just biological women?
In sum total or in specific circumstances?
Right. Well, no, I just mean like, does Title IX require that it includes everyone or not?
Yeah, I mean,
would you say that's a fair characterization of what what she's alleging?
Yes, I think so. And they cite a recent decision that was about Title VII, a case called Bostock. And actually, right. Justice Gorsuch wrote the majority opinion in Bostock. And in that case, they ruled that workplace discrimination on the basis of sexuality or sexual orientation or gender identity is unconstitutional based on Title VII, because Title VII is designed to be is designed to eliminate distinctions on the basis of gender. In the workplace, gender is not supposed to be a deciding factor. Sex is not supposed to be a relevant factor in terms of employment in the average workplace. Title IX actually exists to do the exact opposite. Title
Right.
IX exists for the purpose of creating a sex distinction that acknowledges the difference between men and women and affirmatively provides women with an equal opportunity to access sports at the youth and at the collegiate level.
Right. And I think what's interesting is this case basically, in my mind, hinges on what is the burden of the law that is placed on the states. When a state passes a law that says, a transgender woman is not a biological woman and therefore is not allowed to compete in this sport in this context, does the law look at that situation and say, no, you are actually denying someone their constitutional rights? And that's basically what the Supreme Court was deciding here. And the majority in the Supreme Court decided that no, because it put simplistically, because Title IX was set up, as you said, to create a distinction between sexes based in the athletic context, based on ultimately on physical differences, on differences in funding and all of those things that we've discussed already. They basically said that there's no burden put by the law on the states to allow transgender athletes to compete. Now, they didn't close the door to transgender participation in women's sports. And I think that's an interesting distinction here. What the decision hinged on was that Title IX does not preclude those laws from happening, in their opinion, because the idea of transgender athletes transitioning from male to female was not in the intent of the law at the time, due to the physical questions that we already talked about.
Yeah.
So they do talk a little bit about, which I found interesting. I think they basically said that like they don't want to be the people litigating whether, if you take puberty blockers, for example, which is kind of one of the big things that came up in this case a lot. If you take puberty blockers before you hit puberty and, limit at least some of your physical development into a biological male, does that mean that you should be able to participate in women's sports because maybe you are, less strong now than your average man, and maybe you're as strong as an average biological female? And the Supreme Court basically said that we're not interested in litigating that. That the question that we're interested in is, does Title IX preclude these laws from happening at all? And they believe that based on their interpretation of the original law, no. Now, can there be other laws that are passed at the state level or the federal level, or, sport by sport and governing body by governing body rules? They said absolutely. But that's not what the Supreme Court exists to do, is litigate that problem. And I don't know. I think that like there's just the facts of the case, which I think, like, personally, just to put my cards on the table, I think that constitutionally, I think it's the right decision. But I think there's an interesting constitutional question there. There's an interesting question about, what we've talked about many times, which is like, how do sports organizations handle the transgender question in a way that's, not a culture war issue and instead just takes everyone seriously? I don't know where you've landed as you've kind of been digesting both the majority and the minority opinions, but I think I come away from this having a clear understanding of the laws, but also I do feel like we landed in the correct place.
Yeah. I think at the outset, for me, it's worth noting that the facts and the scope of this case and this opinion are actually quite specific and quite narrow.
Right.
This is not the facts of this case and the legal analysis of this case are not about anyone at any level of development identifying as a different gender and having availability to play.
Right.
Even like the people bringing this claim actually acknowledge that like it says the plaintiff agrees that the state may prohibit most biological males from women's and girls teams. They actually concede that. What Kavanaugh says is that they contend that safety and competitive fairness, which are sufficient reasons to exclude most biological males, do not justify excluding a relatively small subclass of biological males, namely those biological males who identify as female and have taken puberty blockers or hormones. When we're talking about sex-based discrimination or classifications, they are permissible only when the government, in this case, the state governments, have a important government objective to achieve, and that the distinction, the classification is substantially related to achieving that objective. In this case, the objective that West Virginia is claiming, and that most of the other states who have passed similar laws, are two things: safety of female athletes, and then fairness of competition. So safety and fairness. And and the plaintiff, the athlete in this case, is not contesting that in most cases biological males would pose a risk to both competitive fairness and to safety. What ultimately, at the end of the day, what this case comes down to, and what both the majority and the dissent spend a lot of time on, is a very specific, I'm going to use the exact words, subclass of biological males who have never undergone male puberty at all. And the contention by the plaintiff is that those people would not present a risk to safety or to fairness, and that they would actually be similarly situated physically to the other female athletes, the biological female athletes that they were competing against. That question is kind of the core crux of this case.
Right.
And ultimately, like, it seems like in the scientific and medical world, that question is not settled at all.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And I don't know. I think that's a question that we have addressed specifically on the show multiple times. And I think it's interesting. I think you framed this very well. You know, when we look back on even 6 years ago when we first started having this conversation on this show, which was by no means the first time the conversation was had, but you know, when we started talking about it, the ball was in a very different place in this debate. You know, as you said and as the plaintiff said, the conversation is no longer about should transgender women be in women's sports in general. It is about a specific subset because the cultural consensus has changed, I would say, pretty dramatically in terms of the vast majority of Americans on both sides of the political aisle. You don't really have sizable majorities arguing that sports, basically, that anyone should be allowed to participate as long as they, you know, feel strongly that they should.
Right. Like just for example, like the facts of this case have nothing to do with someone like Leah Thomas, who went all the way through male puberty,
Right.
competed for a men's swimming team, and then transitioned to a female team in college.
Yeah.
Even by the plaintiff's version of this case, that would not apply.
Right. And assuming that what we get to later doesn't happen, I don't think Leah Thomas or someone like Leah Thomas would participate in at the highest level of sports at the current time, which is just it's a big change from where we were.
Certainly not at the Olympics or the NCAA, just based on their rules, but yeah,
right,
culturally as
right.
well.
I think that the dissenting Justice Sotomayor's opinion kind of spends a lot of time talking about the fact that we don't know that transgender women who did not undergo male puberty are not, basically, we don't know enough to say that they could be stronger than their average female counterpart. And the what the majority argues for is essentially that it doesn't really matter in terms of the burden of proof of the law. I don't know what you think about that. That also is definitely like splitting legal hairs to me in terms of my like deep understanding of where the laws are at. But it made intuitive sense to me to say that like the I don't know that the states should be required to account for this legally.
Yeah, that's certainly what the majority ruled. Basically, like one of the core components of Justice Sotomayor's dissent was that it is not unnecessarily burdensome to protect this subclass this distinct subclass that she defines as transgender women who have not undergone male puberty, and on a case by case basis, either at the school board or judicially, review those instances and allow and determine eligibility is one of
Right.
the I think the components of her argument. Justice Kavanaugh basically says that when we're dealing with the Equal Opportunity Clause of the 14th Amendment at the level of intermediate scrutiny, the states are allowed to exclude an entire class based on the situation of the vast majority of that class. That it does not require a case by case basis if if most instances would necessitate the exclusion. And in this case, we are talking about a very, very, very small subclass, right?
Right.
Like transgender issues get significantly disproportionate amount of attention than there actually are transgender athletes. In fact, at the time of this decision, B.P.J. was the only transgender athlete in the entire school system of the state of West Virginia attempting to play in women's sports. So the subclass in West Virginia is one person. And on
Right.
the basis of such a small minority, the state is not required to, according to the majority opinion, take those on a case by case basis. Um, the other problem I think with taking them on a case by case basis is that you open the door to removing the the importance of of sex classifications and focusing on just ability classifications, right?
Right.
If a biological male who doesn't undergo puberty becomes eligible because their ability is similar or below a biological female, what if there's a biological male who identifies as a male who also has the ability at or below a biological female? Are they allowed to play? That's actually a question that Kavanaugh asked. He said, would exemptions also be required for biological males who still identify as male, but contend that they too are no taller, no stronger, no faster than the typical females in their chosen sports? Would those males also not be entitled to play on a women's or girls' team? If not, why not? And again, I think the answer is we don't want judges or school boards making these decisions. Like these decisions are too case by case to have hundreds of different answers on hundreds of different cases. The other issue you could potentially run into with if you make it an ability classification and not a gender classification is, would there be a biological female who who actually does pose a safety risk to other biological females based on her ability, right? Like if there's a basketball player who is 8 inches taller and 40 pounds heavier than any other player in the league, should she be eliminated because she's actually better than the other women? Would that pose a safety risk to them, or would that impact fair play? Obviously not, because at the end of the day, any woman who meets the ability, we want to be able to compete. So those are just kind of like when you take the logic of the dissent to their logical extreme, which is something I think you want to do in these exercises, is say, okay, if we
Right.
apply this rule, what would the extremes of that be? I think those are some of the situations of concern from my perspective that you run into when you consider the dissent's logic. Do those things make sense to you?
I think they make sense, and I think that I don't know what ultimately what we want here is we want common sense rules to be applied. We want women's sports to be protected. We want women to be protected within their sports. Um, and as much as possible, I think we would both say that we want everyone, regardless of their sex or sexual orientation or gender beliefs, to um, have the opportunity to participate in sports. Um, and I don't know. I think when I look at where we're sort of slowly landing here, we're seeing a patchwork of state laws that are dependent on the political orientation of the state across the U.S., and then you have some governing bodies at a higher level that are making unilateral decisions, like the NCAA. Um, and in those circumstances, we are removing the burden from the federal court systems or the state court systems to say, you must, as the state of West Virginia or the state of Idaho or the state of Ohio or whoever, you must create constitutionally a case by case process that you will process exceptions for this specific type of transgender woman who maybe or maybe not should be allowed to participate in women's sports. Instead, what we're doing is we're saying the law allows, under what the Supreme Court's interpretation was, the law allows for states or sporting bodies to make this decision. And then the question is, what do the people want? We are a democracy after all. And I don't know, to me, I think this is a decision for sporting bodies, and I think it's a decision for Congress and for state Congresses to sit down and ask, like, what are the edge cases that we need to be considering? You know, how difficult should it be to get an exception in the circumstance? Should you be allowed to get an exception at all? Like, I think that those are all reasonable questions to ask, and reasonable questions that are not, because of the complexity required to address them, are not constitutional rights questions. There are co-ed avenues in sports that do exist, obviously, and in most ages and levels of games. And so, like, it's not like, these rulings specifically restrict school sports, which does matter, obviously, for people who want to participate in their school. But I do think that, like, if the majority of states continue to go in this direction, that doesn't mean that transgender athletes have no avenues to compete in sports. And I think that's something that is ignored in the debate pretty often. And I think, like, yeah, I don't know. I think that's basically where I stand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reality is that a decision like this allows the diversity of America to function in a way
Right.
that selects for people's desires, right? Like, if B.P.J.'s family, if sports are the most important thing, there are many states in this union that
Right.
would allow that B.P.J. to compete in their youth sports. If another person lives in California and their parents are extremely worried that their daughter will be playing against biological males in their sports league, there are plenty of other states that you can go to, like West Virginia or Idaho, that would protect that girl from that your daughter from having that happen to them. Like, the reality, like, people can kind of select to what they prefer. And that's democracy working at the state level. And I think that's actually
Right.
good. Do you have like, I don't know, like, I'm not scientific enough to have an opinion on whether or not preventing male puberty actually does eliminate physical sex distinctions. I don't know, do you have an opinion on that? Or I don't want to spend too
I
much
would say that
time on something that I'm very not unknowledgeable about.
I would say that I'm not well informed enough at a scientific study level to be able to confidently say, you know, one or the other is objectively true. I feel like I've seen discussions on both ends, and I've seen studies and interviews and such that do seem to indicate things in one direction, and studies that seem to indicate the exact opposite. And I think that, like, that does, it ultimately is complicated because this is a hot button topic, and it, like issues like the abortion issue, it's a very different cultural and constitutional question. But you have one side that says an objective moral truth, in one case is aborting a fetus before the baby is born, is that killing a person, or is it not? Is the fetus not a person until it's born? In this case, the question is, you know if you transition, does that mean you are no longer biologically, under the law, the gender that you were born as? uh, uh, Around half the country believes one thing, around half the country believes the other thing. And I think that, like, when we sit down and have honest conversations, taking that seriously, and also trying to take the situations that transgender athletes who do want to participate in sports, and I really do empathize with that. you know I don't think that, like, the whole debate ultimately hinges on, do you believe that the law at its core, when it's distinguishing between genders, considers transition to be legally viable?
Yeah.
And if you don't believe that, then you know you're going to agree with this decision. And if you do agree that it's viable, then you're going to end up frustrated by this. And I think that that's, like, it is ultimately, to me, a democracy question rather than a constitutional question.
I think the other specific, yeah, I agree with you. I think the other specific, I guess, part of this case I would like to discuss is the idea of, and you hear this, I think, from some people who advocate for transgender participation, which is, what's the harm,
Right.
right? Especially at the youth level. Is it really so damaging to these people to just let, especially since there's so few transgender athletes, to just let them in? What actually is the harm? And that's something that Justice Sotomayor mentioned, saying that it is actually, not a zero sum situation, because in the case of B.P.J., every girl who tried out for the track and field and cross country teams made the team. So in that case, if everyone can be included, then it does no harm to allow B.P.J. And Kavanaugh addresses this head on. And this is where I would like to end by talking specifically about Kavanaugh as the ambassador for sports at the Supreme Court. But on
Yeah.
this issue in particular, he says sports are highly competitive and generally zero sum. Someone wins and someone loses. Every athlete who makes a team takes a roster spot from another athlete. Every player who earns playing time reduces the playing time of a teammate. Every player who makes the starting lineup sidelines another who remains on the bench. Every competitor who wins a race or competition deprives another athlete of that victory or medal or prize. I mean, that's just right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I
that's
mean,
just
it is right.
sports.
It is sports. And I think when I look at Sotomayor's question, I think it's and ultimately why I agree with this decision is that is taking an edge case where one person seemingly does not affect the outcomes because maybe it's I'm not familiar with B.P.J's school, but maybe it's not the highest quality, athletic program. Um, let's say everyone does make the team, whoever tries out, and B.P.J makes the team. Maybe B.P.J is not particularly good. I have no idea, but assuming B.P.J doesn't have physical advantage over the rest of the players, competes, has a great time. That may be true in that specific situation. But if we go suddenly to a competitive school, and B.P.J does get a spot and someone else loses out, then you have to ask that zero sum question of, you know, did someone lose their spot because of an unfair competitive advantage? And that's what happens. What we are trying, when the Supreme Court looks at this case, and this is my kind of summary thought, they are asking, does there need to be a blanket provision mandated by law for all states to allow for this exception?
Yeah.
And I don't think that from the law, in the interest of fairness, that we can extrapolate that over every state. I don't think that is fair from a sporting perspective.
while the litigation was ongoing, according to Kavanaugh's opinion, BPJ competed in high school track and field on a girls' team, and BPJ won the regional in both of their events, being discus and the shot
Shot
put,
put, right? Yeah.
and won the high school state championship in shot put. So that's interesting fact.
Yep.
Um, Briefly, I would like to talk about Kavanaugh. You and I was talking to you before the podcast about how Kavanaugh has kind of become the sports ambassador on the court. And whenever there is a sports related case, be it sports gambling or uh, um, what's the acronym? Name, image, and likeness, NIL for
Mm-hmm.
college players or college players being paid, or now the transgender issue. Whenever he's on the majority side, they seem to hand in the case. Um, Infamously, in his hearing, we know that he is, in fact, a high school coach for his daughters. He has many daughters
Right.
and they play sports. So, like, he's a guy who, like, understands this thing. And I think that at the end of his opinion, he does a very, very good job of, like we mentioned at the beginning, balancing the empathy and while also understanding the importance of sports. He mentions that we acutely are aware of the difficulties sometimes faced by boys who identify as girls and by girls who identify as boys. We admire the desire of all students, including transgender students, who want to participate in sports. Then he goes on this. He has an amazing paragraph. I boxed this entire paragraph where he's just talking about the importance of sports. He says women and girls who play sports care deeply about these things. They obsess about them. And then he kind of gets a little like, this is like really, really good writing. He's like,
It's 30 for
they
30
spend
stuff. Yeah.
extraordinary time and effort to train in the heat and in the cold, to work out early in the morning and late at night, to get a little faster, to become a little stronger, to jump a little higher, to shoot a little better, to watch a little more video, to make the lonely journey back from an ACL tear, to scrap for playing time, to start, to win. I mean, he goes on and on. It really is like it's a 30 for 30 moment. Like, this is a guy who like understands it. And then he ends by saying, no student athlete on either side of this issue, whether a biological female or a transgender, deserves to be ostracized or vilified. Um, Certainly, culturally, these issues get a lot of attention, and we certainly hope that um, people who are struggling with this on either side are not being bullied or ostracized in that they have community, that they're not being bullied, that they're not facing harassment of any kind. And I think that he does a good job of being firm on the law while also bringing empathy to the issue. And ultimately, like you said, I think this case was decided rightly. I think that it's an issue that belongs at the state level, and I think that the compelling interest to protect women's sports for women, which is the basis on which Title IX exists, is good. And I think that
Yeah.
ultimately, from a legal perspective, it would be extremely burdensome to require courts to adjudicate transgender participation on a case by case basis based on physical characteristics of how they perform as compared to biological men or biological females based on physiological metrics and attributes.
Yeah. I think it's exactly right. I think that's very well put. And obviously, if you disagree with us or have thoughts about what we shared from either side of the political aisle, we'd love to hear from you. We welcome all questions and hope that you won't vilify us on social media. No, I'm just kidding. There is a place, however. I think this is a perfect opportunity to segue into a place full of vilification, ostracization,
Yeah.
bullying, lack of good faith, and general all around shenanigans. And of course, that is, unfortunately, the WNBA, the circus of our times.
I mean, this is a situation where we go from highbrow to lowbrow at the most
So
extreme
fast,
level.
0 to 100. 0
And
to
like,
100.
the reason I wanted to spend most of the time on the Supreme Court is that I really don't like engaging with trollish behavior. And Kavanaugh
It's so bad.
brings, the Supreme Court justices, every single justice, maybe with the exception of Thomas in this particular case, brought a level of seriousness and goodwill and rigor to the issue. Um, how some when I see people on Twitter just like trolling people by like, well, like, yeah, but what's a woman, or like those kind of things, like I find that ultimately to be a very reductive and unhelpful thing that is just fueled by affirmation and confirmation bias on social media. And I think a lot of what we're going to talk about on the remainder of this episode is that.
Just
I think
disastrous.
it starts with something I guess that we could classify as serious, which is
Yeah.
Sophie Cunningham, the one of the stars of the Indiana Fever, a teammate of Caitlin Clark, being asked about, you know, women participation in sports, and she said, girls' sports should be for girls. Is basically the essence of what she said. Um, yeah, I mean, that's kind of like the core. I don't know if you wanted to kind of walk us through the timeline on what kind of how this
Sure.
escalated.
Sure. I mean, it's been a disaster. The WNBA, has been genuinely, since it kind of launched into the limelight of popular culture when Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA, has just, it seems like just the league culture has just been desperate to cause controversy in all kinds of situations. So Cunningham comes out with this, obviously a very firm personal stance, um, and almost immediately backlash, began coming in from different areas of the league, obviously from social media, but from actual people within the league. There were fans. One particular incident, I think this happened during the World Cup, which caused us to kind of not have time to cover it at the time, but there were some fans at a Seattle Storm game. I guess it was probably Seattle versus Indiana. And there were fans who were supporting Cunningham and basically had signs regarding her stance on women's sports. And Seattle Storm co-owner Celeste Keaton basically came up and started like confronting them and berating them.
The owner of the
And
team.
yeah, and like the owner of the team comes up to fans and is like, "How dare you, take this stance?" That obviously caused a lot of controversy. Shortly afterward, in kind of semi-related news, um, player DeJohnai Carrington, I think is how you pronounce it, um, really aggressively fouled Cunningham on her way up to the basket, got a flagrant 2, was ejected from the game. Then seemed to be just take to her phone on social media in the locker room after being ejected, tweeted white privilege out.
Was that related
After
to the transgender issue, or was that just related to Sophie Cunningham in general?
I
I
don't know.
guess.
I don't know. I'm not saying that that's like directly correlated. I'm just saying like in the wake of all of this happening, in the aftermath of Cunningham taking the stance, the incident occurred. When asked about it, Cunningham's coach basically kind of waffled on it and seemed to kind of defend Carrington, the player who fouled her, instead of defending her own player. It seemed like Caitlin Clark like put her head in her hands in the press conference when the coach began talking in that way, which just also looked weird from an optics perspective. And so all of this firestorm has been going on. Everyone's been opining. The WNBA has been weighing in from the very top.
Let me add two things.
Then
let me add two things to this. So
okay.
Cheryl Reeves, who was the head coach of the Minnesota team, she wears a shirt in the pregame against the Fever that says "Trans kids belong." She wears that shirt very, very publicly. It's posted on social media and things like that. And then that's contrasted with many fans who are wearing shirts that support Sophie Cunningham being asked by or ordered by league security to cover up or change their shirts in the stands. And that even happened last night, Monday, August 17th. Yeah, that continued to happen where fans were being told by league officials, league security to cover or change shirts. And the WNBA actually released a statement saying that was wrong and that those fans should not have been asked to do that, which is good that they're finally kind of stabilizing this. But again, a hypocrisy for a coach to be allowed to wear a shirt on one side, but then fans trying to wear a shirt on the other side are ordered by the league to not. All of this, John, while high drama and controversial, I classify all of this within the range of like the normal intersection of politics and sports.
I mean, maybe semi-normal. I don't know about normal, but
we are about
chaotic normal.
We are about to veer off the road of normal. And that is because former NBA players, Inez Cantor, who is now Inez Cantor Freedom, and Royce White have announced on social media that they are women and are eligible for the 2027 WNBA draft. Inez Cantor, um, who, he wanted to change his last name identity and now he wants to change his gender identity, I guess. So he's
Apparently.
no stranger to changing things about himself and his identity. Um, this is obviously trollish behavior of the highest order. Ines Cantor begins this with a super produced, very trollish video. He follows it up with an interview with former head coach and now right wing political commentator Bruce Pearl, doing a sit down interview to discuss his journey to becoming a transgender woman at the age of whatever age he is, 30 something. Is he 40 yet? No, he's 30
No idea.
something. Yeah, at the age of 34, he has now discovered for the first time that he's actually a woman. The same thing with Royce White. And I was for several days the league was pretty silent on this. I wondered if they were just going to ignore it and pretend that it didn't happen. Um, I don't think it helped the WNBA that they then announced that they were having a summit with 12 league officials to determine player eligibility and then walked away from that summit without having determined what player eligibility would be, again prompting the trollish questions of, can the WNBA determine what is a woman? Um, all of this, again, even in our tone, significantly more lowbrow, significantly more trollish. I
Yeah.
don't like at all what Inez Cantor or Royce White are doing. Um, I don't like I don't like the backlash that fans have received for simply wearing apparel or holding signs on one side of an issue when players and head coaches on the other side of the issue are openly allowed to voice their opinions. I think that sports leagues within reason should be a place for free speech. If you're going to allow speech on one side, you should allow speech on the other side. um that's just a stance that I hold. It's not an enforceable stance by the government, but it's just what I believe.
Sure.
And I think that Sophie Cunningham has made her stance. I think that it is I think that when you make yourself a public figure in that way, you also need to be held to a higher standard. So, Sophie Cunningham, if you are very passionate about protecting the safety of girls, should you be the ring girl at a UFC fight featuring Conor McGregor and at a league owned by Dana White, two men who are not particularly concerned with protecting women or girls? Like, definitely not. Is that something that public should be doing? No. When you make yourself a public figure on this issue, is it fair to criticize you on those things? Yes, it is. Like, be consistent with your messaging. But just chaos at the highest order at the end of the day.
Yeah, I would just like to say it is trollish, but Enes Kanter and Royce White declaring themselves eligible for the WNBA draft is an easy layup for the WNBA. It is
Will they make it?
Let's be clear about this, because it is trollish. Don't get me wrong. It is literally straight out of a Matt Walsh comedy film, which was actually made. If you remember Lady Ballers from a couple years ago.
Yeah.
This is a real plot. Notably, around a month ago, Donald Trump, in fact, announced that he wanted LeBron James to declare eligible for the WNBA and that he would win the WNBA with LeBron James. So this is an idea that people have trolled about for a while. And I just think it is so obvious that, given the entire highbrow conversation we just had, that you do not want people, whether they identify as a woman or not, with the force of a biological male to be competing in women's sports, because it makes women's sports meaningless. It does not mean anything if you allow that. And if you can't draw the line as simple as saying that someone who just declares that they've transitioned without taking any transition steps whatsoever, not to mention pre-puberty, the fact that you can't even draw the line there as a league, to me, is irresponsible as a league. And so, I don't know. I think that it's not the classiest move of a former athlete to be stepping out in this way. But I genuinely do think like this is just an own goal by the WNBA that they can't even they can't even take a stance. Like if this is the stance they're going to take, why shouldn't they be eligible? You know what I mean? Like
Yeah. I
to
mean,
take it
yeah,
seriously for a
you
second.
mentioned this as an open layup. Are they going to score it or are they going to miss it like Angel Reese missed 9 layups against the Fever on Sunday night?
Yep.
That's an open question. I
It is
do
an open
think
question.
like it is interesting of like what are the WNBA's paths forward? Path one is just ignore Inez Cantor and Royce White and do nothing, right? Like they could just make no change to their eligibility, just proceed as normal. As far as we know, there's no transgender player in the WNBA. They're just going to ignore these two people, brush them off as individuals who are not engaging seriously, and just move on.
Does Ennis Cantor sue the WNBA at that point?
For what?
Like,
There's no
could we
requirement to
get there?
be what?
Like, yeah.
What do you mean? Like on what? By what basis?
I don't
You have the right to for the WNBA to declare you eligible legally? That's I think that's nonsense.
well,
You
I
don't have
don't
the
know. No,
right.
I'm not saying a serious legal case, but I'm saying like could it get there is the question I'm asking. Like could he sue the teams for collusion,
Oh, I
like
don't know.
Kaepernick style? Like
I, yeah, I don't know. I
that's
really
the
don't.
only risk. And if they ignore him, that's the only risk I think that they would run,
I'd be
basically.
surprised
That was
about
my only
that.
point.
The other option number two would be for the WNBA to just align with the majority of sporting bodies at this point and make a distinction like the IOC does or like, but it
Right.
seems like culturally that would face a lot of pressure. That many
Sure.
people in their league, players, coaches, executives would not support an actual biological sex exempt like distinction. So would that cause trouble from within? The other alternative would be, but like ultimately, like this isn't going to be proved until an actual transgender athlete tries to play.
Right, of course.
What will they do then? That's the
Right.
question. Like, not Inez Cancer, not Royce White, like someone who actually is seriously and earnestly a transgender person who has been transgender. When they try to play at whatever level of ability they are, what will the WNBA do? I honestly don't know. They're the league that I think is most likely to just say shrug their shoulders and let them play. But I think that would force so many other players who have been silent on this issue to take a stance and would potentially risk like splitting, causing a civil war and potentially splitting the WNBA.
And it would, in addition, be a break from the college system that feeds into the WNBA,
Right.
which I think is notable.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. That person would not have played NCAA collegiate basketball.
Right. They'd
So,
be coming from some other system if they
right.
were to get that far.
Either straight from
So,
high school or from Europe.
right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I really think that the number one reason why the WNBA would not like to do that is not about the competitive advantage issue. I think it is about the fact that it would force so many more people who would be this person's teammates or opponents, coaches, to have to take a stand on this issue. And I think they're going to find that just like in the rest of life, this is a very polarizing and a very split issue. And there is not as much unity in the WNBA as they might think there is when they wear their trans kids belong shirts.
I think that's probably true. And what do you think is going to happen? That's my question.
I think they're
Do they
going to
just
ignore it.
ignore?
Yeah, I think they ignore
Yeah.
it. I think if I was a PR person and I was paid to consult with the WNBA,
Yeah.
I think that's what I would tell them to do is just never acknowledge that these two people are real people.
Right.
Yeah,
they're just random Twitter people. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, for me, it's like I don't take this super seriously.
No.
I think the WNBA is a league that might be confronted with this issue in a serious way in the next 5 years or so, and I'll be very interested in having that conversation. I just don't want to like degrade my own intellectualism by having to deal with people of such low interest to me.
I just my primary takeaway here after I think a good conversation and a conversation that I hope if you listeners have thoughts on that, you continue with us. Um, I just think the WNBA has done a terrible job of branding over the last couple of years. Like, the WNBA has elevated in terms of brand awareness at a completely new level compared to what they were 3 years ago. Like, it is a key cultural league in terms of conversations in a way that it just absolutely was not before. Um, and it is 0% making the most of it in terms of like league leadership making it a respected party in the sports world. And that's just ridiculous. It's really unfortunate for women's basketball, in my opinion.
During the period in which the WNBA has been more popular than it has ever been, the WNBA media has constantly, and many veteran players have constantly undermined and belittled the best player, the most popular player in the WNBA by a significant margin, exponentially more popular than anybody else. And now is openly hostile toward fans of a particular political persuasion. Like,
Yeah.
I don't even think that the WNBA have to, like, if people want to counter protest Sophie Cunningham, like, that's their prerogative. Like,
That's
Sophie
totally fine.
Cunningham
Yeah,
is a
it's
public
America.
figure. She
Yeah.
chose to speak. You can counter protest her all you want. To go after regular fans who are supporting Sophie Cunningham by threatening to like remove them from stadiums for things that they're wearing or for signs that they're holding is completely outrageous and is continuing to just alienate fans at a time when the WNBA needs more fans. Like,
It's just bizarre to me.
there is nothing that the WNBA needs more right now than fans. They should be welcoming every fan that they can with open arms.
It's like the equivalent of me walking into Costco wearing political gear, and depending on the political persuasion of the person, like at the card scanner at Costco, being like, "No, you can't come in." Like,
Yeah,
you are
I'm
denying
revoking your
yourself
membership.
business. Yeah, like what?
Yeah, it's completely outrageous. And like the WNBA set aside that as well, just like completely missing the mark on using Caitlin Clark to grow the long-term legacy of this league.
Right. It's
I
unserious.
see significantly more stuff on my social media about the coverage of Caitlin Clark by the WNBA than I see anything that happens on the games of the WNBA. And that's just not where you want to be.
Well, clearly it's where they want to be, but I don't understand why.
It's not where they should be.
It's not where they should be. I don't understand why. It's like when you have the most, see Shohei Ohtani, someone who I think is like on a similar, I think Caitlin Clark is as recognizable as Shohei Ohtani, or at least close to it.
Yeah.
And Shohei Ohtani is like the superstar of Japan.
Right.
He's everywhere. He dominates an entire country. And when you have an athlete at that level in a league that has struggled desperately for viewers for decades, to just throw it away is insane to me. But
I'm not sure if there are 10 NBA players with better name recognition than Caitlin Clark.
Probably not.
It is a once in a lifetime opportunity for the WNBA that they are completely punting on.
Yeah. I do think in terms of like basketball fans, there are more than 10. But I think in terms of your average household, I do think genuinely she would be in the top 10 of NBA players.
Yeah.
In terms of name recognition. Genuinely. Yeah. I'm thinking about it now. This is
true. There we have it. We got through it. We got through the chaos.
Yep.
Man, I thank you so much for having this conversation with me, for coming prepared, for doing the reading. I know not every podcast that we do is as academically rigorous as this one, even though it kind of derailed at the end. But it is fun when I get to put on my legal hat and we get to kind of dive in. And so thank you for being up to this and for tackling a difficult subject in the way we did, and for the preparation, because I know formulating words and trying to be sensitive to an issue like this is hard, and it does take a lot of preparation and mental work. And I think we both are very sensitive to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for doing the same. And thank you all for listening. And for those of you who have been with us on this conversational ride with us many times over the last few years. I hope, again, to close out, I hope you all know that we both really do take this seriously, and I think ultimately, like, that's what this whole show is about, is making space to like take a serious sports question seriously. So Chad, I appreciate you doing that and bringing your legal expertise here. I always enjoy hearing you break down a Supreme Court ruling for us. So.
Yeah. And I do, like John said at the beginning, I do consider this issue like an open dialogue with any of our listeners who want to engage with this seriously. Like, this is an issue where, like, there are certain types of responses that I'm just going to ignore that I could imagine happening. But if someone does want to engage who disagrees with me with a level of with a level of seriousness and goodwill and exchange of ideas, like, meet me in the YouTube comments, meet me on my Instagram, like, meet me on Twitter. I'm more than happy to engage and consider this a dialogue, as long as that dialogue is happening respectfully and in good faith.
Yeah. Yep. I couldn't have put it better myself.
So yeah, meet us in the comments if you'd like, if you agree, if you disagree. And thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Like I mentioned at the beginning, if you missed our last podcast, we talked about some lighter sports subjects and also Spider-Man. So make sure to check that out as well. And until next time, when we'll be back with another episode of Crunching Tackles, we hope that you all continue to be well and be safe, and we'll talk to you later.
All right. Cheers, guys.